In the spring of 1887, the town of Callow Creek voted to close its school. The vote was 5-1, taken on a Tuesday afternoon in April, while the mud was still soft from snowmelt and the creek still running brown and loud below the cottonwoods. 5 men on the town council, Councilman Dolph Reed at the head of the table, looked at the winter's feed bills and the territory tax roll and the unpaid freight invoice for the new stovepipe, and they decided a one-room schoolhouse was a luxury Callow Creek had not yet earned. The lone dissenting vote belonged to a man named Pollard, who ran the feed store and who, it was said later, voted no less out of conviction than out of a long-standing irritation with Reed about a property line. The motion passed. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Edna Briggs, was given 30 days to vacate the building and encouraged to seek a position elsewhere. No one on the council expected much to come of their decision. No one expected any resistance at all. Certainly not from a 24-year-old woman from Cheyenne with 2 years of teaching behind her and no particular standing in the valley. And no one expected any resistance from an 8-year-old boy who had not yet mastered long division. They were wrong about both of them. What the council did not know about Edna was considerable. She had come to Callow Creek in September of 1885 after answering a territorial advertisement, one of a dozen that ran in the Cheyenne paper that summer, offering a modest wage and a rented room above the dry goods store in exchange for teaching all children in the valley who could be spared from their homestead work. She had expected roughness, and she had found it. The schoolhouse was a single room with 2 windows, a cracked stove, and a floor that needed new boards along the north wall every spring when the frost heaved the ground. She had expected 20 students and generally got 12, with attendance falling in planting season and rising again in November when the fields were done. She had not expected to love the place the way she came to love it, and she would not have used the word love herself if you had asked her, but she had memorized which child needed the multiplication table spoken aloud instead of written, and which child's family spoke only German at home and needed the reader explained twice, and which child came in cold on Mondays because the weekend's fire had gone out and the family had been slow to restart it. She knew these things the way a person knows a place they have chosen, rather than merely arrived at. Ray Harmon learned about the vote the evening of the Tuesday it was taken, sitting at the kitchen table while his father, Walter, came in from the barn with his coat still on and sat down heavily in the chair by the window. Walter was a lean, tired man of 35 who had been farming 40 acres south of the creek road for 7 years and who had accumulated across those 7 years a debt to the Territory Land Office and a second debt to the feed supplier that together amounted to more than the farm earned in a good year. He had voted yes, he told Agnes, because the school tax was a line item on the county assessment he could no longer cover, and because Reed had made a reasonable case that the money could be redirected to the road maintenance fund, and because, if he was honest with himself, he had voted yes because it was easier than voting no, and explaining why to the 4 men sitting to his left and his right. Ray heard all of this from the kitchen doorway. He had not been invited into the conversation. He stood with one boot on and one boot off, half changed from his afternoon chores, and he listened to his father explain the vote to his mother in the careful, flat voice Walter used when he knew he was explaining something he was not entirely proud of. And then he sat down at the table and ate his supper without saying a word. Agnes watched him eat. She knew her son, and she knew the silence was not acceptance. She was right. Ray went to bed that night and lay looking at the ceiling of the loft for a long time, and what he was thinking was not the language of an 8-year-old reasoning through a civic decision. It was simpler than that. Miss Briggs had spent 6 weeks the previous fall teaching him to read maps, real surveyor's maps with the creek lines and the property corners marked in ink. And she had told him that the man who read the map was never lost Even when he was in ground, he did not know yet. Ray had been thinking about that sentence for months. The idea that a map was a kind of company, that a person could carry the shape of the land inside him, had settled into him the way certain ideas settle into certain children and stay forever. He was not prepared to lose the woman who had given him that. The next morning, he walked the half-mile to the schoolhouse before his chores and found Miss Briggs already there, sorting through her books and stacking them in the wooden crates she had borrowed from Pollard's store. The 30-day notice was already pinned to the door, written in Reed's careful official hand on town council letterhead. Ray read it. He read it twice, because he read everything twice now. Then he looked at the crates and at the stacks of readers and the rolled maps and the globe with the scratch across the Pacific that someone's elbow had put there in 1886, and he said plainly that she should not pack. Edna looked at him for a moment. "I have 30 days, Ray," she said. "Then you have 30 days to stay," he said. She did not agree to that, not that morning. She kept packing. Ray went home and did his chores. His father did not look at him across the breakfast table, and Ray did not look at his father, and Agnes refilled the coffee cup and kept her thoughts where she generally kept them, close and quiet. 3 days later, Edna stopped packing the crates. She did not stop because Ray had argued her into it. She stopped because she had spent 3 days carrying books from the shelf to the crate, and finding that her hands were slower about it each time, and because she had a letter sitting unopened on the table from a school board in Laramie, offering her a position starting in September, a real salary in a proper building with 2 rooms, and she could not make herself open it. She put the books back on the shelf. She pulled the pin from the council notice and folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, and did not read it again. She had not exactly decided anything. She had simply stopped doing the thing that would have led to leaving. She told Ray on Saturday that she would continue the lessons in her rented room above the dry goods store. He could come in the mornings if his father would allow it, if the other children's families would allow it. She could not pay for heat or materials, but she still had her books, and she had a good blackboard that she had bought with her own wages and that she considered firmly her own property regardless of what the council thought. Ray told his mother first, then his father. Walter looked at the stovepipe for a while. Agnes said it was Ray's time to use as he chose in the mornings before the heavy work started. Walter did not say anything against this, which was as close to permission as Ray needed. The room above the dry goods store was 12 feet by 14. Edna had a cot, a table, a single chair, a trunk, and 2 shelves of books. She borrowed a second chair from the widow Haas, who lived 2 doors down, and who had no children but who had opinions about their education, and expressed those opinions by appearing with the chair and a tin of molasses cookies the first morning, and staying unofficially in the corner for the next 2 hours as a kind of civilian witness. By the end of the first week, there were 4 children sitting on the floor with their primers, because there was no room for more chairs. By the end of the second week, there were 7. Ray's job that second week, self-appointed, was to walk the creek road south and east and tell the Homestead families what was happening. He was 8 years old, and he had the particular conviction of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to be embarrassed about caring too much. And he talked to every mother he could find while the men were in the fields. And what he said, in various forms and with various degrees of clarity, was that Miss Briggs was still teaching, and that their children could still come, and that the council had voted wrong, and that someone ought to do something about it. The mothers listened. Frontier women in the Wyoming Territory in 1887 had a well-developed sense of what their children stood to lose if they grew up without letters or numbers, and several of them had opinions about Dolph Reed that they kept private in mixed company. They listened to Ray, and they sent their children to the room above the dry goods store, and 2 of them sent small wrapped parcels of food, along with the children, addressed to no one in particular, which Edna accepted without comment and placed on the shelf beside the molasses tin. It was the widow Haas who suggested the petition. She made this suggestion on a Thursday afternoon at the end of the second week, sitting in her corner chair while Ray practiced writing in his composition book. She said that a petition with enough names on it would need to be read into the record at the next council meeting, by law, and that 30 names would be more than the council could dismiss as a handful of malcontents. Ray looked up from his composition book. He asked how you wrote a petition. She told him the general idea, which was a statement of the request, followed by the names of the people making it. Ray wrote a draft that evening on a clean sheet of paper from his composition book, in his best hand, which was careful, if not elegant. The statement read, "We, the families of Callow Creek, ask the town council to reopen the school on Birch Street and restore the teaching position of Miss Edna Briggs, whose instruction has been of benefit to our children, and whose removal was voted without our knowledge or consent. Ray Harmon, age 8. He brought it to Edna the next morning. She read it without expression, then read it a second time. She said he had spelled consent correctly, which he had not expected to either. She handed it back without changing a word. Ray spent the following 2 weeks riding the creek road with the petition folded in his coat pocket, stopping at every homestead he could reach in the mornings before Edna's lessons, and in the late afternoons when the school day was done. He was on a bay mare named Clover that his father had let him use since he was 6, a patient animal with a choppy trot and an excellent sense of where the soft ground was, and Ray rode her out every morning into the wide spring light of the valley, with the petition growing heavier in his pocket, one signature at a time. The mothers signed. A few of the older daughters signed. Pollard signed and told Ray he had been waiting for someone to do exactly this. The widow Haas signed first, and in the largest hand, her name taking up a line and a half, which Ray privately admired. By the end of the 3rd week, he had 22 signatures. Edna's 30 days were nearly up. Councilman Reed learned of the petition sometime in that 3rd week. He learned of it the way a man in a small town learns of most things, from a conversation he was not part of that was repeated to him afterward by someone who thought he would find it amusing. He found it faintly amusing. He mentioned it at a social evening at the Mercantile, in the company of 2 of his fellow council members and several of their wives, as evidence that the schoolteacher had put ideas in the children's heads that were above their station, which was the sort of thing that happened when you hired a young woman from the city and gave her a room and a blackboard and no proper supervision. The wives in the room were quiet at this, which Reed took for agreement. Ray heard about Reed's comments from Tommy Pollard, who was 12 and worked the counter at his father's store on Saturdays and overheard more than he was meant to. Tommy told Ray on a Saturday morning that Reed had called the petition a child stunt. Ray asked Tommy to spell stunt, which Tommy did correctly. Ray wrote the word down in his composition book and thought about it for a while. He went back out on the creek road that afternoon and collected 4 more names. On the morning of the day the June council meeting was scheduled, Ray woke to rain. Not the ordinary spring rain that came soft off the mountains and sat in the grass for a few hours, but the kind of June storm that the territory produced once or twice a season, a hard driving rain that came from the northwest with the wind behind it, and that had been falling since before dawn. The creek road south of town ran low between 2 rises, and in a storm of this size it collected water from 3 drainage draws that fed down from the bench above. Ray had ridden that road in all seasons for 2 years. He knew what a June storm did to the low section. He also had 31 signatures in his coat pocket. He had collected the 31st the previous evening from a homestead woman named Mrs. Crane, who had signed in a slow, careful hand and told him she thought what he was doing was the bravest thing she had seen a child attempt, which had made Ray uncomfortable enough that he left quickly and did not look back. The council meeting was at 4 in the afternoon. The town was 4 miles north on the creek road. He told his mother where he was going. Agnes stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the rain, and looked at her son, and looked at the rain again. She said he was 8 years old. He said he knew the road. She said the low section would be running. He said he had ridden it in March when it was worse. She stood there a long moment, and then she went to the peg by the door and took down his father's oilcloth coat, which was too large for him by several sizes, and put it over his shoulders and buttoned the top 2 buttons herself, and didn't say anything more. His father was in the barn with the 2-year-old heifer who was having a difficult spring, and Ray did not stop to tell him he was going. He saddled Clover and rode north. The road was passable in the upper section, the ruts deep and the footing soft, but nothing Clover hadn't managed before. She picked her way with care, ears forward, and Ray kept her to the grass verge where the ground was firmer. The rain came in hard off the northwest, and the oilcloth coat kept his torso dry but nothing else, and by the first mile his boots were soaked and his hands were cold on the reins. He kept the petition folded inside the inner chest pocket of the coat, pressed against his shirt, which he had decided was the driest place he had. The low section between the 2 rises was running, as he had known it would be. The water wasn't so deep that Clover would need to swim, but it was knee-deep on the mare in the center and moving faster than Ray liked, the color of the red clay draw and carrying small branches and debris from the bench above. He sat on the bank for about 2 minutes looking at it. Clover stood beside him with her head low and her nostrils working. He rode into it. Clover lost her footing once in the center and lurched sideways before catching herself, and Ray went low on her neck and put his weight to the uphill side, and she recovered and pushed through. And then the water was shallowing and they were on the far side, and Ray sat up and Clover shook her head and blew hard and kept walking, because she was a patient mare, and patient mares keep walking. The last 2 miles into town were easier. By the time Ray reached the council building, a frame structure on the north end of the main street with a painted board above the door that read Callow Creek Municipal Affairs, the meeting had been in session for 40 minutes. He tied Clover at the post, which was hard to do with cold hands, and went up the steps and opened the door. There were 11 people in the room, besides the 5 council members. Ray stood in the doorway in his father's oversized coat, dripping onto the floorboards, with his hat in one hand and the petition held out in the other. His boots made a sound with each step that no one in the room could reasonably ignore. Reed looked up from the table. He took in the boy, the coat, the dripping water, and the folded paper, and he said, in the flat measured voice of a man who considers interruptions a form of disorder, that the council was not accepting public comment this session. Ray said he had 31 signatures and he would like them entered into the record. The room was quiet for a moment. Pollard, who was seated near the back as an observer, leaned forward in his chair. One of the council members Ray did not know well looked from Ray to Reed and back. Reed said that a child could not enter items into the official record. Ray said the signatures belonged to adults, and he was only the one who had brought them, and that if the council would not take the paper, he would read the names aloud himself. He was 8 years old, and he was soaked through, and he was shaking. Though whether from cold or from the particular trembling that comes when you have decided to do a thing and then done it, and are now standing in the place the decision has delivered you. It was difficult to say, possibly both. Pollard stood up. He said that under the Territorial Administrative Code, a written petition signed by 20 or more registered adult residents was required to be received and read into the council minutes, and that the council was obligated to act on it within the current or subsequent session. He had, it turned out, looked this up specifically. He held out his hand toward Ray. Ray crossed the room and handed him the petition. Pollard read all 31 names aloud in a clear, unhurried voice, while the rain tapped against the council room's 2 windows, and Reed sat at the head of the table with his hands folded and his expression that of a man who is reassessing the cost of his original decision. Ray did not stay for the vote. He was beginning to shake badly by then, the cold having caught up with him now that he was standing still. And one of the women in the audience, a Mrs. Forsythe, whose daughter attended the unofficial lessons, put her hand on his shoulder and steered him toward the wood stove in the corner, and made him stand in front of it until the trembling slowed. Someone brought a blanket from the back room. Someone else went to check on Clover and came back to say the mare had a stone bruise on her near fovea that had likely been bothered by the rocky stretch below the low section crossing. Ray received this news with a gravity that Mrs. Forsythe found touching. He asked if Clover would be all right. She said she would need a few days of rest and easy ground. He went home in a borrowed wagon that evening, Clover tied at the back with a wrapped hoof. And he told Agnes what had happened while she took his wet clothes and hung them by the stove. He did not tell her about the creek crossing until later, and she did not press him for details she had already guessed. By the following morning, he had a fever of the kind that announces itself in the night, the thick, hot weight behind the eyes and the body that feels at once too heavy and too far away. Agnes sat beside his cot in the loft and put cold compresses on his forehead and gave him broth that she made from the last of the winter stock bones, and she told him the mare was in the barn with her hoof packed and that he was not to worry about anything until the fever broke. He was sick for 3 days. On the second evening, Edna came. She had walked from town in the early dark, the road dry enough now that the storm had passed, and she sat in the chair Agnes had placed at the foot of the cot and read aloud from a book of natural history she had brought in her bag. She read for 2 hours, her voice steady and unhurried in the lamplight, while Ray lay half awake and half in the particular floating place that fever makes. And Agnes sat in the kitchen below and listened to the voice moving through the floorboards. When Edna finally stood to go, Agnes came up the ladder and thanked her and offered her the spare room. But Edna said she had the walk back and the morning lessons to prepare. She put on her coat and picked up her bag and went down the stairs and out into the cool night air. And Agnes stood at the window and watched the lantern move down the road until it turned the bend and disappeared. The fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day. Ray came down from the loft and ate a bowl of porridge and sat at the table while the spring light came in long and clear through the kitchen window. His father was at the table too, which was not uncommon in the mornings. But Walter sat for a time after he finished his coffee without rising, which was not Walter's ordinary habit. He said to the table mostly that he had voted wrong. Ray looked at his father. Walter did not quite look at Ray, his eyes on the cup in front of him, but the words had been said plainly and without qualifier, and Ray, who had heard his father explain most things away in careful and reasonable language, understood that this was different. He said that he knew. Walter nodded once. He took his cup to the basin and went out to the barn, and the kitchen was quiet. And Agnes poured herself the last of the coffee and looked out the window at the mountains and did not say anything, which was, for Agnes, a form of fullness. The town council met again on the last Thursday of June and reversed the earlier vote 3-2, which was not the clean reversal that the petition had asked for, but was enough. The schoolhouse on Birch Street would reopen in August. Miss Briggs was offered reinstatement at her original wage with a formal letter of apology that Reed signed in his careful official hand, and that read, in its most significant sentence, that the council had acted in haste on insufficient consideration of the community's educational needs. It was the closest Dolph Reed came, in writing, to saying he had been wrong. In person at the feed store the following week, he told Pollard that the petition had raised points he hadn't fully weighed. Pollard did not smile until Reed had left the building. Edna received the letter on a Friday morning and read it at her table in the room above the dry goods store. The Laramie letter had been sitting unopened for 6 weeks now, beside the salt cellar and a cup of cold tea. She opened it, finally, that same Friday afternoon. The Laramie board had filled the position in May, the letter said, but expressed a willingness to consider her for any future opening. She set the letter down. She looked around the 12-by-14 room, at the borrowed chair and the 2 shelves of books and the blackboard leaning against the wall. She looked at the stack of composition books on the table, 7 of them, belonging to the children who had been coming to her in the mornings, and at the creased and slightly water-damaged petition that Ray had given her after the council meeting, which she had pressed flat and put under the heaviest book on the shelf. She folded the Laramie letter and put it in the stove. She started the fire for her tea, and while it caught, she took the composition books and stacked them in the canvas bag she used to carry things to the schoolhouse, because the schoolhouse was going to need a great deal of cleaning before August, and she intended to start Monday. If any of this felt like a victory to her, she did not express it as one. She expressed it as a list of tasks, written in her neat hand on a page in her own composition book, starting with the north wall's floorboards and ending with the procurement of a new stovepipe. The schoolhouse on Birch Street reopened on the 14th of August, 1887, on a Monday morning that came in clear and cool with a smell of pine from the mountains. 9 children arrived at the door in the first hour. By the end of the week, there were 15. By October, there were 19. And Edna had written to the Territorial Education Board to request a second set of primers, citing enrollment growth, which was the kind of letter that gets filed without ceremony, but that contains, for those who know how to read the numbers, the whole shape of a place beginning to take itself seriously. Ray was back at his desk by the 3rd day. His handwriting had gotten no worse during his absence, and his maps were still rolled in the wooden tube under his seat where he had left them in April. He took his desk back without announcement and opened his composition book and waited for the lesson to begin, which is what you do when you have done the thing that needed doing, and the thing is held. The years after that were long and ordinary in the best sense of the word. Walter paid down the feed supplier debt by 1891 and the land office debt by 1894. Both on time, which was not a small thing in the Wyoming Territory in those years. Agnes put in a kitchen garden that grew ambitious enough by 1895 to supply more than the Harmon table, and she sold the surplus to the mercantile on a handshake arrangement that lasted 12 years. The mare Clover recovered from her stone bruise and worked another 7 years before she was retired to the near pasture, where she spent her last seasons in the particular contentment of old horses who have earned it. Edna taught at the Callow Creek Schoolhouse for 24 years, from its reopening in August of 1887 until the autumn of 1911, when the joints of her right hand had stiffened enough that she could no longer write the full alphabet on the blackboard without stopping to rest. By then, she had taught the children of the children she had first taught in that 12-by-14 room above the dry goods store. The school had grown by stages, from 1 room to 2, and then to a proper 3-room building raised by a subscription in 1902, in which the Territory recognized the Callow Creek School as one of the better-attended rural institutions on the eastern slope. She had argued for the expansion with the county board in 1901 using enrollment figures that she had been keeping, in precise, neat columns, since 1887. The board approved her request on the second submission. The third councilman who had voted against the school's reopening in June of 1887, a man named Abel Crocker, who ran a small cattle operation south of the road, brought 3 loads of pine lumber to the building site when the new school went up, and no one mentioned the 1887 vote during those 2 days of framing, though several people were thinking about it. Reed himself attended the dedication of the new building in 1902. He was older by then and had been out of the council for 4 years, and he stood near the back of the crowd and applauded with everyone else when the school board chairman read out the names of the donors. And if he felt the particular interior reckoning of a man watching a thing he once voted to end outlast his own relevance, he gave no outward sign. Reed was, at his core, a man of the community rather than an enemy of it. And that was true even when his imagination of what the community needed fell short of what it actually was. The school operated for 41 years in total, from that August morning in 1887 until 1928, when the county consolidated the smaller rural schools into a larger district building in the town proper. By then, the original schoolhouse on Birch Street was well past its serviceable years. The north wall replaced twice and the roof once, but it was still standing when the last class left it, and someone had the sense to leave the blackboard on the wall. Ray Harmon grew up and became a county surveyor, working first under the Territorial Survey Office and then, after Wyoming's statehood in 1890, under the State Land Board. He spent 30 years reading and making the maps of the eastern slope, the creek lines and the property corners and the elevation marks, accumulating in his hands and his notebooks the particular knowledge of a place that Miss Briggs had first told him was a kind of company. He married a woman from Douglas in 1901 and raised 4 children in a house 12 miles from the homestead where he had grown up, and he brought those children to the Callow Creek Schoolhouse every September through 1911, and then, after Edna retired, to the school that replaced it. And he told them, though not often and not with great ceremony, that the school was there because it had been worth riding 4 miles in a June storm to keep it. He said it once, specifically to his youngest daughter, who asked him about it when she was 8 years old, and therefore precisely old enough to understand the answer. He and Agnes drove out to the schoolhouse the last morning of 1928, after the county consolidation notice had been posted and the building was formally closed. Agnes was 71 by then and had not been inside the building in years, but she walked through the door and stood in the long room with its 2 remaining windows and its empty desks and its blackboard, with the ghost marks of chalk lessons still visible in the wood, and she put her hand on the frame of the door to the small anteroom where the children used to hang their coats, and she held it there a moment. If you are the kind of person who grew up in a place where someone fought to keep the school open, you understand the shape of what Callow Creek had, and what it almost lost and what it took to hold it. Leave a word in the comments about a teacher who stayed when they could have left. They are worth remembering, and so is the 8-year-old who understood that before most adults did. Edna Briggs had not lived to see the school close. She died in 1921 in the house she had kept in Callow Creek since 1893, in the bedroom whose east window looked across the creek to the bench above, where the pines stood dark and clean against the morning sky. She was buried in the Callow Creek Cemetery, in the row second from the stone wall, and in the spring the meadowlarks came to the bench above the creek, the same as they always had. And the pines did not change, and the creek ran brown and loud in the melt season, and clear and quiet in August, which was the month the school had reopened, and the month, of all the months, that she had loved best. Ray visited the grave the spring after she died, and stood there for a while without removing his hat, which was not his ordinary habit. Then he removed his hat, and held it in both hands the way a man does when he is in a place that deserves the gesture. The valley spread out below the bench in all its early spring color, the green coming back into the grass along the creek bottom, the cottonwoods leafing out pale and trembling, the homestead roof lines visible through the trees, each one a place where someone's children had grown up. knowing how to read a map. He put his hat back on and walked down the hill.